Hello everybody. Today we will be going over elasticities, specifically elasticity of demand. Perhaps in another video I will go over price elasticity of supply and income elasticities as well. But for today, we're only going to go over price elasticity of demand. So let's begin. What is price elasticity of demand? It is the measure of responsiveness a consumer or producer, well, in this case, only consumers because we're talking about demand, the measure of responsiveness a consumer would have in their quantity demanded when there is a change in price. So if price changes a lot by a certain variation, the amount demanded for a certain good is definitely going to change, because as we saw in the other video on demand, there's always a negative relationship between quantity demanded and price. So how do we calculate this elasticity? In brief terms, we would calculate it with the formula highlighted in purple. The percent change in quantity demanded over the percent change in price is your price elasticity of demand for that specific good. Again, PED would vary. For example, pens versus MacBooks or toys versus bikes. PED is always going to vary, and every good has its own PED. Always remember that you have to take the absolute value when you consider price elasticity of demand. You may get a negative answer, but always remember you always take the absolute value for PED, because in economics terms, it helps simplify understanding the relationship there is for a certain good and how price impacts the quantity demanded. That's the main reason why we take the absolute value. So always, always, always take the absolute value. Okay, so I would like to do a sample problem, which I got from a textbook. So for a certain good, in this case TVs, customers bought 6,000 TVs before at $255. They now buy 5,000 TVs when the price is $300. So price increased. So how do we calculate the PED? Essentially, PED, again, percent change in quantity over percent change in price. So again, it's the change, so it's always going to be before versus after. So your final minus initial over initial, essentially. So the change here would be 5,000, which is your final, minus 6,000 over 5,000, again your initial. In this case you would multiply it by 100, but again, if you do the math, the hundreds are going to cancel out, so I'm not going to really do that. I'll still keep it here just so you don't get confused. Sorry about that. Now the final price we got was 300 minus 255 over 300. So if you do that with the 100%, just so you guys don't get confused, but again, this will always cancel out, so generally you don't need to have that, but if it helps you, it helps you, so I kept it. The PED you would get once you take the absolute value, always remember, take that absolute value, you would get around 1.33 equals your PED. You can check that, and we would round one decimal place, so 1.3 is the price elasticity of demand for this problem. So I hope you understand now how to calculate price elasticity of demand, and it is always going to be like this generally. In some classes you might take, your professor might teach you the midpoint formula to calculate price elasticity of demand. I won't go over that in this particular video, but in upcoming segments, I will teach that as well. So I wanted to go over the graphs and how price elasticity is inelastic or elastic, when it's that, and when it would be perfectly inelastic, unit inelastic, and perfectly elastic. So when you have a price elasticity of demand which is greater than 1, you will have an elastic good. What does that mean? What does this mean, as in, why would that good be elastic? Well, since there was a change in price, the consumer, as a result of that change in price, was very responsive in changing the quantity he demands. So we saw that with the problem earlier. He or she or they were buying less or fewer TVs when price was higher at $300. So as a result, there was elastic demand, price elastic demand, because their responsiveness increased. They were very responsive in changing what they demanded. So whenever you have price elasticity of demand between 1 and infinity, you will have elastic price elasticity for a certain good. On the contrary, inelasticity. When is a good inelastic? Well, it's the complete opposite. You as a consumer are not changing the amount or quantity that you demand, whether price changes or not. So to continue, your good will always be inelastic when your PED value is between 0 and 1. And we can take the example of Coca-Cola or sugary beverages, especially those sugary goods that are addictive. Generally, if price changes for those goods, the consumer will not change their demand in response to changes in price. So as a result, those goods are inelastic, and you can think of many other goods similar to that, and maybe you can comment them below in the comment section. In addition, you have perfectly inelastic, unit elastic, and perfectly elastic. These goods, they only are sort of they're very idealized, let's say. They're idealized examples. They don't occur in real life as much. There are certain examples of them, but not many. And you always have perfectly inelastic at 0, unit elastic at 1, and perfectly elastic at infinity. So these are the graphs for inelastic, elastic, perfectly inelastic, and unit elastic. They're very important, I'd say, to remember, because in a lot of exams and a lot of questions that are asked in competitive exams too, like in the IB or even in college and university levels, these questions where we have to identify the graphs usually comes up. So have a good grasp over this. And moving on, the determinants of price elasticity of demand. So what makes price elasticity the value it is? 1, number and closeness of substitutes, income spent, the proportion of your income spent, the length and time, which I will go into, and necessities versus luxuries. So 1, number and closeness of substitutes. So to really explain this determinant, think of how Coca-Cola has many substitutes, such as Pepsi or 7-Up. Very similar branding, very similar taste as well. So as a result of it having so many substitutes, Coca-Cola would technically be an elastic good. So the more substitutes and the more similar those substitutes are, your good is more elastic. In comparison, you can take the example of insulin. You don't have substitutes for insulin. And as a result, it is inelastic. It is very inelastic, in fact. Income spent, proportion of income spent. The more of your income that is being spent on a good, the more elastic that good is. For example, if you have to take a chunk of your income, let's say $2,000, just to spend it on a new laptop, that would mean that laptop is pretty elastic, unless you urgently need it, which is, we'll assume ceteris paribus in this case. Income spent, if you are spending less on something and it doesn't take up a huge portion of your income, generally that is inelastic, versus more income proportion spent, it is an elastic good. Length in time, again, the urgency factor that I was talking about. If you urgently need to book a flight ticket, then that flight ticket would be inelastic given you just have such a short period of time left. Versus if you are waiting for prices to change and you have a lot of time to spend in order to book that flight ticket, then it would be inelastic. Necessity versus luxury, the final determinant that we consider. Generally speaking, luxuries are taking a greater proportion of your income. So as a result, they're not necessary for your well-being and are considered elastic, while necessities, they are essential for our lives, and whether or not the price changes for a necessity, we're gonna buy it. We're gonna buy very same amount so that we are well off and our well-being is well off. So necessities are generally inelastic, and you can think about examples yourselves. I'm pretty sure you have a lot to consider on that part. So that was price elasticity of demand. I apologize, I am a bit sick, and in parts of the video you might have noticed that. I apologize if that caused any inconvenience. However, please give feedback and criticism. I'm very open to that. I always want to improve these videos, and thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.